Hello, welcome back. I'm going to continue the conversation talking about basic patterns across world religions. Let me get started by sharing my screen with you. I hope you're doing well. Let's see. Let's go right here. Let me make that like that. And then what I want to do is just close these out for us and make that big. All right. So yeah, we last class what we talked about was shamanism, and we talked about connecting to the cosmos and axis mundi, this need across cultures and traditions to create spaces where it's believed that the divine and the sacred come together in a more concentrated, a more punctuated, in a stronger way. And so we looked at some examples of maybe constructed sacred spaces or axis mundi, such as the temples in Egypt, or stupas within Buddhist traditions, in the Second Temple within the Jewish tradition. We'll return to some of those things as we progress forward this semester together. Um, but for now, what we want to do is we want to continue the conversation by talking about Middle Eastern prophets. I apologize. I see a typo there. Then East Asian sages. And that will probably be what we cover for today, looking at basic patterns across world religions. Then thereafter, we'll pick it up in our last segment, our third segment on basic patterns across world religions, by looking at scriptural religions and some of the features across scriptural religions, and briefly talk about mystery religions as well. So let's get back into it, and let's start with I'm talking about Middle Eastern prophets. All right, I'm going to go right here. Okay, so Middle Eastern prophets, we see, especially in the region of the world that we call the Middle East, right? We see going back to 700 before the Common Era, so 700 before roughly the life of Jesus of Nazareth, 700 years prior. We see the emergence of this concept of the prophet, or sage, depending on where you're at. So in the Asian traditions, you see the concept of a sage, which we'll talk about next. In the Middle Eastern traditions, you see the concept of a prophet. And there's some similarities, but also some differences between the two. So we want to walk through these two together and distinguish those similarities and differences. So a prophet, in terms of its etymology, its root, it comes from the Greek, and it has two related meanings. A prophet can mean a person who speaks on behalf of a deity, or a person, or another way to define a prophet could be a person who foresees the future. And these two terms are often conflated, meaning a prophet is often understood as someone who does two things, right? Who stands as an intermediary between God and the people of God, and also someone who could see the future, predict the future. The prophetic tradition, you have prophets dating back to the Temple of Delphi in Greece, where you had virgin priestess who, under the inspiration of the god Apollo, delivered prophecies from up high on a mountainside within a natural cave. So there you have again, right? Thinking back to that notion we talked about last lecture of axis mundi. And so these caves high up in the mountains in Greece are kind of these axis mundi, right? Where you have the divine in this world connecting, and it's from that location that these priestess, right, acting like prophetess, they are able to deliver prophecies, right, to foretell the future. Of course, we have the Abrahamic prophetic tradition, which cuts through the Jewish, the Christian, and the Muslim traditions. So we're going to need to talk about that as well. So the prophetic tradition is central in many ways to these three major world religions. Again, the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim tradition. Prior to those three traditions, those three Abrahamic traditions, they're known as Abrahamic because they all locate their roots, their origins in Abraham, the prophet Abraham. And so, that right there, it denotes, it underscores the importance of the prophetic tradition to both each of these three traditions, right? Again, they root their origins in a prophet, the prophet Abraham. Prior to Abraham, we had Zoroaster, who's the founder of Zoroastrianism. Zoroaster lived more than 2,500 years ago in eastern Iran or Afghanistan, and he preached a type of monotheism amongst with other teachings that to one degree or another would shape the Jewish tradition and thereafter the Christian and Muslim traditions. So Middle Eastern prophets, you have a range of them that are important across the traditions. Again, from the practice of prophesying in the remote mountain sanctuary of Apollo in Delphi, Greece, where the women priests, the priestesses prophesied. Again, this is an example, right? This is an example of a constructed sacred site or a axis mundi here on Earth. Here, this time an example out of Greece. We looked at examples out of the Buddhist tradition in Asia, in Nepal. We looked at an example in Egypt. We've looked at an example in Jerusalem, and now we have an example in Greece, right? Across the world, you see these. Again, you have these natural sites that become sacred sites because of their splendor. So here we have the Corinthian caverns in Delphi, Greece, where priestess prophesied and other rituals also occurred at this type of site. And you can see that connection, right, where we call these priests, but you can think back to that first pattern we talked about, which was shamanism. You remember shamans, right, which are dispersed across the world. It might go by different names. They too act like intermediaries between the divine in this world. So again, we see these continuities across these religious traditions. The prophet is the intermediary, right? The prophet shouldn't be conflated with a shaman. There's differences between the two, but a prophet coming out of the Middle Eastern part of the world is an intermediary. Here we have prophets from the Jewish tradition: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Each of these prophets, according to the Jewish tradition, have wrote a book, which is now a part of the Hebrew Bible, which we'll talk about when we talk about the Jewish tradition. Indeed, there's a whole collection of literature within the Hebrew Bible, which is known as the prophetic books. And so these prophets, right, these intermediaries who wrote these books, become a part of the canonical tradition of the Jewish tradition. Of course, there's the prophet Moses, who goes up to Mount Sinai and receives the Ten Commandments, also known as the Decalogue. This story gets recounted in Exodus chapter 20. And so he too is an important prophet within that the Jewish tradition, and not only the Jewish tradition, in the Christian tradition, and within the Muslim tradition. Moses is a highly respected prophet across the traditions. So again, the role of the prophet is an important role within these three Abrahamic traditions. The prophet, before we go on and talk about East Asian sages here, the prophet is one that stands in between as a intermediary between the divine and the people of God. And the prophet is less about foretelling the future and more about forthtelling, being forthright. And the prophet often will say the thing that needs to be said to the people in order to try to correct them and bring them back in alignment with God. So often the prophet has to step in when the people have kind of gone astray, when they've lost their way. And thus often a prophet is resisted by the people of God because they bring a difficult message that the people often don't want to hear. It's not a coincidence that Jesus of Nazareth, who is understood to be a prophet, priest, and king in the Christian tradition, it's not a coincidence that Jesus of Nazareth once said, a prophet is without honor in their hometown, right? So a prophet often is someone who, is kind of a difficult figure because they have a message, and it's often a message of repentance. It's also a message of that's given to a group that needs to change their ways or change their mind, so to speak. So, a prophet's a difficult job, to say the least. And again, it's more about forthtelling, telling the truth, rather than foretelling the future. But that could be an aspect of a prophet as well. All right. So, in addition to prophets, we have East Asian sages. East Asian sages, such as Shakyamuni the Buddha, right? Which we'll talk about, of course, when we begin our conversation of the Buddhist tradition. Asian sages, within Asian religious traditions, moral leaders across Asian traditions are often known as sages. So, whereas a prophet, and here's a point of difference between prophets and sages, whereas a prophet brings God's message, the sage is the wise person who speaks the eternal wisdom. It's not eternal wisdom that belongs to a god or a deity, but it's eternal wisdom that's part of the natural order of the world, of the cosmos. And so anyone could access this eternal wisdom if they simply put the teachings of the sage into practice, right? And so the truth of the teachings of the sage are in putting his teachings or her teachings in practice and seeing how they affect your life, how they bring, for example, more peace or more enlightenment to your life. So in other words, the authority of the sage's message, it resides in its inherent wisdom rather than being God's word. So sages would be, so for example, Buddha within the Buddhist tradition, Mahavira in Jainism, Confucius in Confucianism, would be examples, and Laozi in Taoism would be another example. And we'll talk about some of these sages in our time together as we progress. Okay, so sages, so again, a Confucius would be an example of a sage within Confucianism, of course. And then the first principle energy, you know what? Let's press on. Let's talk about the first principle energy. I see we're right about at 11 minutes. I think we could cover the first principle energy in 4 minutes. So this tradition that cuts across, different parts of the world, the energy of first principle tradition emerges around 2,500 years ago. At the heart of this type of thinking is this ideal that a energy um, the energy created this world rather than, say, a personal God that is trying to direct our history and direct our fate. But rather, there is this divine force that's behind all that exists. This is energy, and it's an impersonal energy. It shares sometimes people have noted that this concept of the first principle or energy that's behind everything that exists in an impersonal way, that it might share some commonality with modern physics more so than, say, traditional notions of God. So, and within this ideal of the first principle, the divine, it simply exists, or rather, it kind of underlies everything that exists. So, for example, we'll look at, say, Chinese Taoism or the Hindu Upanishads, our pre-Socratic philosophy, our philosophy of the early Greek world. Within each of these traditions, there's examples of teachings that share a lot in common with this ideal of the first principle energy. All right, so I think what we want to do is we're going to end it there, and then next class we'll talk about avatars, and we'll talk about scriptural religion, and talk about mystery religion. So let's wrap it up there for now. All right, all right. Thank you so much, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.